I remember the exact moment when I realized my children no longer saw me as a person. Just an inconvenience, an afterthought, a relic collecting dust on the mantelpiece. It was at my grandson Jacob's high school graduation party. A beautiful Sunday afternoon in early June, the kind where the breeze carries the scent of fresh-cut grass and charcoal grills. My son Edward had rented a pavilion at Riverside Park, complete with catering and a photographer. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Everyone gather around for the family photo. My daughter-in-law Vanessa called out, her voice carrying across the lawn. I set down my lemonade and smoothed the wrinkles from my dress, the blue one I'd bought specially for the occasion. As I approached the gathering crowd, Vanessa's smile faltered. She leaned over to Edward and whispered something. He glanced my way, nodded, then called out, "Mom, would you mind taking the picture? The photographer is busy with the graduate photos." I froze mid-step. But I'm family too. An uncomfortable silence fell. My daughter Regina cleared her throat. "Mother, there are so many of us already. And you know how these photographers charge by the person." "We'll take one with you later," Edward added, not meeting my eyes. But later never came. And as I stood there, camera in hand, watching my children, their spouses, my grandchildren, all smiling as if nothing was wrong, something inside me shifted. In that moment, I decided if they could so easily erase me from the family portrait, perhaps it was time I reconsidered how prominently they figured in my estate plans. What they didn't see coming. They got comfortable with their inheritance far too soon, and realized far too late that my final act wouldn't be one of quiet submission. In the very next breath, I made sure every last one of them understood that I wasn't just an old woman waiting to die. I was Dorothea Pendlewick, and I still had plenty of life left to live. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when my children would have been horrified at the thought of excluding me from anything. I raised Edward and Regina as a single mother after their father, Harrison, passed away from a sudden heart attack. Harrison was only 42, too young to die, too young to leave me with a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old. But grief doesn't negotiate. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom home in Millfield, the mortgage barely manageable on my librarian's salary. I took on evening shifts at the local bookstore, taught piano lessons on weekends, anything to keep food on the table and my children's futures bright. Edward's college applications, Regina's dance recitals, doctor's appointments, school events. I never missed a single one. I was mother and father both, determined that my children would never feel the void Harrison left behind. When Edward graduated from college and secured a position at Westmore Financial, I couldn't have been prouder. And when Regina earned her master's in architecture and joined Skyland Developers, I felt like all those sleepless nights had finally paid off. My children were successful, independent. I'd done my job. What I didn't realize was that once they no longer needed me, they would stop seeing me entirely. The change was gradual, like most heartbreaks are. First came the missed Sunday calls. Then holidays became negotiations. "Mom, we were at your place last Christmas. We should really spend this one with Vanessa's parents." Birthdays remembered with last-minute cards or hurried phone calls between meetings. I told myself it was normal, that they were busy with their own lives, their own families. I didn't want to be that mother, the one who guilts her children into attention. But then Harrison's insurance policy matured, the one he'd taken out when the children were born. The payout, combined with the sale of our family home, now much too large for just me, left me with a sizable estate. Suddenly, my children found time for me again. "Mom, you really shouldn't be living alone at your age," Edward insisted over dinner at his place, a sprawling colonial in Westbrook Hills. "The guest house on our property would be perfect for you. Close enough that we can check on you, but you'll still have your independence." What he didn't mention was that having me occupy the guest house would save them the expense of hiring a nanny for their 3 children. I'd become the live-in grandmother, always available for childcare, never inconvenient. Regina had her own suggestions. "Mother, have you updated your will recently? You know Edward will just blow through whatever you leave him on more renovations. For that ridiculous house." I was thinking, since I'm handling all your medical appointments and finances anyway, perhaps it would make sense for me to be the executor. I smiled politely through these conversations, nodding as if considering their words, while inside I wondered when exactly I had transformed from their mother into a resource to be managed, an inheritance to be divided. Then came Jacob's graduation, party, and the family photo incident. It wasn't just being asked to step aside that hurt. It was the casual way they did it, as if my exclusion was the most natural thing in the world. As if I had already ceased to exist in their minds. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my apartment, the sensible one-bedroom I'd moved into at Edward's insistence, though I'd wanted the charming cottage by the lake, and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Gray had long since claimed my once auburn hair. Lines mapped my face like roads on a well-traveled atlas, but my eyes, those were still the same, still bright, still seeing. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Whitman, my attorney for the past 30 years. "Dorothy," he answered on the second ring, using the nickname only he was allowed to use. "Everything all right?" "I need to make some changes to my will," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Substantial ones." There was a pause. "Are you sure? We just updated it last year." "I'm sure. And Marcus? I'd like to keep these changes private for now." Another pause. "Of course. When would you like to meet?" "Tomorrow," I said. "I don't want to wait." The next morning, I walked into Marcus's office with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. We spent 3 hours going through every aspect of my estate plan. By the time I left, my financial future, and what would happen after I was gone, looked completely different. I didn't tell Edward or Regina about these changes. Instead, I started living differently. I sold my sensible apartment and bought that cottage by the lake I'd always wanted, using cash from my personal savings. I adopted a golden retriever from the shelter and named him Harrison, after their father. I joined a local theater group, signed up for watercolor classes at the community college, and booked a 2-week trip to Italy, something Harrison and I had always planned to do. My children were, predictably, aghast. "Mother, have you lost your mind?" Regina demanded when she came to see the cottage. "This place is a maintenance nightmare. The property taxes alone will eat through your savings." "I can afford it," I replied simply. "And a dog? At your age? Who's going to walk it when you can't manage anymore?" I scratched behind Harrison's ears as he leaned against my leg. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I managed just fine. Edward was equally concerned, though his worries took a different form. "Mom, these classes, this trip, you're burning through capital that should be preserved for your later care, or for the grandkids' education." I smiled at him over my cup of tea. "I've made arrangements for my care, Edward, and as for the grandchildren, perhaps you should start a college fund for them. After all, they're your children." His face reddened slightly. "Of course they're my responsibility, but you've always talked about leaving something for them. And I still might, but right now, I'm using my money to live my life." The tension between us grew over the following months. Edward and Regina began checking in more frequently, but their concern always circled back to my spending, my decisions, my apparent recklessness with what they had already mentally designated as their inheritance. Then came Thanksgiving. I'd invited everyone to the cottage, my first holiday as hostess in my new home. I spent days preparing, determined to make it special. I baked Harrison's famous apple pie, set the table with my grandmother's china, and even put up early Christmas decorations to delight the grandchildren. Edward arrived first, with Vanessa and their children. His expression as he entered was critical, assessing, as if he was calculating the value of the furnishings. "It's smaller than I expected," he said, not bothering to hide his disappointment. "It's perfect for me," I replied. Regina and her husband Daniel arrived next, with their teenage twins. She immediately began rearranging the table settings. "Mother, you've put out too many plates. The kids should eat at a separate table." "There's room for everyone," I insisted gently. "I want us all together." The meal began pleasantly enough. The food was good, the grandchildren animated as they shared school stories. But then Jacob, Edward's oldest, mentioned my upcoming trip. "Grandma's going to Italy in the spring. She promised to bring me back a real Venetian mask." Edward's fork paused midway to his mouth. "Italy? Again?" "Mom, I thought we discussed this." "We discussed it," I agreed. "But I don't recall reaching any conclusion that would prevent me from going." Regina set down her glass with more force than necessary. "Mother, this has gotten out of hand. First the cottage, then the dog, now international travel. You're going to deplete your entire estate before you're 70. "And what if I do?" I asked quietly. The table fell silent. Even the grandchildren sensed the sudden tension. "What do you mean?" Edward asked, his voice strained. "I mean, it's my money. I earned it, I saved it, and now I'm choosing how to use it." "But what about your legacy?" Regina pressed. "What about what you're leaving behind for the family?" I looked around the table at my children and their spouses, at my grandchildren who were watching with wide eyes. Legacy isn't just about money, it's about the example you set, the values you pass down. Edward leaned forward, lowering his voice. "This isn't like you, Mom. You've always been practical, responsible. Now suddenly you're acting like what?" I challenged. "Like I have my own life? Like I matter outside of what I can give to all of you?" "That's not fair," Regina interjected. "We care about you, not just what you can give us." I nodded slowly. "Then why wasn't I in the family photo at Jacob's graduation?" Another silence, heavier than the first. Edward and Regina exchanged glances. We didn't mean us," Edward stumbled over his words. "It was just easier," Vanessa finally said. "With the lighting and the number of people, it wasn't personal." "But it was," I said softly. "It was very personal to me." I stood up and walked to the sideboard, opening the drawer to retrieve an envelope. "I wasn't going to do this today, but perhaps it's necessary. I've made some changes to my estate plan." Edward's expression sharpened. "What kind of changes?" "Substantial ones." I returned to the table, but remained standing. Half of my estate will now go to the Millfield Public Library, where I worked for 30 years. They're establishing a new wing for children's literacy programs. It will be named after your father. "Half," Regina echoed, her voice faint. "But what about the other half?" "The other half will be divided. But not equally, and not immediately." I looked directly at my children. "You'll each receive a portion, but only after completing certain requirements." "Requirements?" Edward's voice had risen. "What are we, children?" "No, you're adults, who have forgotten what it means to be family." I opened the envelope and removed several sheets of paper. "Edward, your portion of the inheritance is contingent upon you spending 1 weekend each month, for a full year, volunteering at the BIA, homeless shelter on Pike Street, the one you drive past every day on your way to work." His face paled. "But that's—" "Regina," I continued, "your portion requires you to teach a free architecture workshop at the community college twice a month for a year. sharing your expertise with people who could never afford to hire someone with your credentials. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The remainder of your inheritances will be placed in trusts for the grandchildren. They'll receive their portions when they turn 25, provided they've completed at least 2 years of either military service, Peace Corps, or another approved volunteer organization. This is ridiculous, Edward finally managed. You can't put conditions on an inheritance. Actually, I can, I said, my voice calm. Marcus assures me it's all perfectly legal. We'll contest it, Regina threatened. You can try. But Marcus has documented everything thoroughly, including the gradual distancing of yourselves from me once you no longer needed my constant support. The family photo incident is just one example. So this is punishment, Edward said bitterly, for not including you in a photo. I shook my head, feeling suddenly tired. No, this is me recognizing that I failed somewhere along the way. I raise children who value what I can give them more than who I am. I looked at each of them in turn. These conditions aren't punishment. They're my final attempt to correct that failure. Daniel, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. Dorothea, don't you think this is a bit extreme? Edward and Regina love you. We all do. I hope that's true, I said. And if it is, then fulfilling these conditions shouldn't be a problem. After all, the homeless shelter and the community college would benefit greatly from your talents. And the grandchildren would gain valuable perspective from service before receiving a substantial inheritance. The remainder of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. One by one, they made excuses to leave early. The grandchildren gave me awkward hugs, clearly confused by the tension. As the last car pulled away, I sat on my porch swing with Harrison, at my feet, watching the sunset reflect off the lake. I wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd irreparably damaged my relationship with my children. But then I remembered how easily they had erased me from that family photo. Not out of malice, but out of something perhaps worse. Indifference. They had stopped seeing me as a person with feelings, desires, a life still worth living fully. The following weeks were quiet. No calls, no visits. Christmas approached, and I decorated my cottage with care, unsure if I would be celebrating alone. I sent gifts to the grandchildren with notes explaining that they were always welcome at my home, regardless of what their parents might be feeling. Then, 3 days before Christmas, there was a knock at my door. Edward stood on my porch, his expression unreadable. "May I come in?" he asked. I nodded, stepping aside. Harrison greeted him with enthusiastic tail wagging, which Edward acknowledged, with a distracted pat. We sat in the living room, the Christmas tree lights casting colorful shadows across the floor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I went to the homeless shelter," he finally said. I looked up, surprised. "You did?" He nodded. "Last weekend. I wanted to see what was so important about this place that you'd make it a condition of my inheritance." And? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so like his father it made my heart ache. I met a man there, about my age. He used to be a financial analyst just like me. Had a family, a home in the suburbs. Then his wife died of cancer, medical bills piled up, he started drinking. Edward's voice trailed off. "He could be me, Mom, if things had gone differently." I waited, sensing there was more. "I keep thinking about what you said at Thanksgiving, about legacy, not just being money." He met my eyes. "Dad didn't leave us money. He left us you, and you gave us everything, your time, your energy, your whole life. And somehow we started taking that for granted." Tears pricked at my eyes, but I held them back. "I never wanted gratitude, Edward. I just wanted to be seen. I know that now." He looked around the cottage, really seeing it for the first time. "This place suits you. It's warm, inviting, like you." "Thank you." He hesitated. I told Regina about the shelter. She's still angry about the will, but I think she'll come around. And you? I asked. Are you still angry? I was never angry, Mom. I was scared. His voice dropped. I've been so focused on building security for my family that I forgot. What makes us secure isn't wealth. It's knowing we matter to each other. I reached out and took his hand. You've always mattered to me, Edward. That never changed. I know, he said, and I'm going back to the shelter next month. Not because of the inheritance, but because that man I met, he needs someone to see him too. On Christmas Day, both Edward and Regina came with their families. There was still tension, still wounded pride on Regina's part. But there was also laughter, genuine conversation. When it came time for photos by the tree, Vanessa handed the camera to Daniel. Everyone gather around Dorothea, she instructed. It's her home. She should be central. As my family arranged themselves around me, I felt something shift again. Not the bitter realization from Jacob's graduation, but something warmer, more hopeful. I had no illusions that one holiday would heal everything, that my children had completely changed their perspective overnight. But it was a beginning. Later, as the grandchildren played with their new gifts and the adults chatted over coffee, Regina sat beside me on the couch. I called the community college, she said quietly. They're interested in the architecture workshop. We're meeting in January to discuss details. I smiled. The students will be lucky to learn from you. You're very talented. She fiddled with her coffee cup. I'm still not happy about the will, Mother. I know, but I understand it better now. She gave me a sidelong glance. Edward said you weren't punishing us, that you were trying to teach us something important. I was trying to remind you of who you are, I said, who we raised you to be. She nodded slowly. I remember when I was little, and Dad was still alive, how he used to say that what we do for others is the only true measure of our worth. He believed that deeply. I forgot, she admitted. Somewhere along the way, I started measuring worth differently. As my children prepared to leave that evening, Edward pulled me aside. Mom, about Italy. I've been thinking. Why don't I come with you? Just the two of us. We could visit those places Dad always talked about. The offer caught me off guard. What about work? He smiled. Work will still be there when we get back. This is more important. Regina overheard and stepped closer. If Edward's going, I want to come too. Daniel can watch the twins for a couple of weeks. I looked between my two children, these adults I had raised who were finally beginning to see me and themselves clearly again. I'd like that very much. After they left, I sat on my porch swing with Harrison, watching as the Christmas lights reflected off the snow. I thought about the changes I'd made to my will, the conditions I'd imposed. They had been born of pain, of feeling erased from my own family's picture. But perhaps they had served a greater purpose than I'd intended. My children were not perfect. Neither was I. We would still have disagreements, moments of frustration, times when we disappointed each other. But something fundamental had shifted. They were beginning to understand that my worth, and theirs, wasn't tied to what we could give each other, but to who we were together. As for the inheritance, I decided I would keep the new terms in place. Not as punishment, but as reminder. A reminder that the true legacy we leave behind isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives we touch, the service we render, the love we share. I am Dorothea Pendlewick. I am 72 years old. I have gray hair and laugh lines and arthritic knees. I have made mistakes and tried to correct them. I have loved fiercely and been hurt deeply. I have mourned and celebrated, failed and succeeded. And I am not finished yet. Not with living, not with loving, not with learning. What they didn't see coming was that in trying to exclude me from the picture, my children forced me to reframe my entire life. And in that new frame, I found not just myself again, but a way to help them find themselves too. After all, the greatest inheritance I could leave them was never money. It was the understanding that every life, at every age, has value beyond measure, including their own. The winter after that Thanksgiving revelation stretched long and gray, but within that uncertain season, unexpected warmth began to blossom. Edward kept his promise, visiting the homeless shelter not just once a month as required in my will, but every Saturday morning. At first, I suspected it was merely perfunctory, an obligation to secure his inheritance, but something changed after his third visit. He stopped mentioning the conditions of my will entirely. Instead, he would call with stories about the people he'd met: a former English professor who could recite Shakespeare from memory, a young woman who'd fled domestic violence with nothing but her guitar and the clothes on her back, a veteran who'd served in Afghanistan and now couldn't bear to sleep indoors. "They're teaching me more than I'm helping them, Mom," he told me one evening, his voice thoughtful over the phone. "I spent my entire career thinking I understood risk and security, but I had no idea how quickly it all could vanish." Regina's journey was more complicated. Unlike Edward, who had found unexpected fulfillment in his service, my daughter approached her architectural workshops at the community college with rigid professionalism. Each session was meticulously planned, each handout perfectly designed. She kept detailed records of her attendance and hours, physical evidence that she was fulfilling her obligation. "Why are you documenting everything so carefully?" I asked when I visited her studio one afternoon. "Do you think I don't trust you?" She looked up from her folder of attendance sheets, her expression guarded. "I believe in being thorough. This isn't a contract negotiation, Regina. It's teaching, sharing your gifts." Her lips pressed into a thin line, a gesture so reminiscent of myself that I nearly smiled despite the tension. "You turned my inheritance into a contract, Mother. I'm simply following the terms." The words stung, but I recognized the defense mechanism. Regina had always protected herself with perfectionism, even as a child. When Harrison died, 10-year-old Regina had coped by organizing his belongings with heartbreaking precision. Socks in one box, ties in another, each item labeled in her careful handwriting. Control was her shelter against pain. "I didn't mean to hurt you," I said quietly. "That was never my intention." She shrugged, turning back to her papers. Intentions don't always match outcomes. As January melted into February, I immersed myself in preparations for my trip to Italy. I purchased guidebooks, studied Italian, phrases, and mapped out the places Harrison and I had always dreamed of visiting. Though Edward and Regina had expressed interest in joining me, I'd heard nothing further about their plans. I tried not to feel disappointed. After all, they had careers, families, responsibilities that couldn't be set aside for 3 weeks of wandering through ancient cities. I was reviewing train schedules between Florence and Venice when my doorbell rang. Harrison the dog bounded to the door, tail wagging in anticipation of visitors. I opened it to find Vanessa standing on my porch, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. "Vanessa," I said, surprised. My daughter-in-law rarely visited without Edward. "Come in. Would you like some tea?" "Thank you, Dorothea." She stepped inside, patting Harrison absently as he circled her legs. "Tea would be lovely." In the kitchen, I put the kettle on and arranged cookies on a plate, watching as Vanessa settled at my table. Something in her demeanor seemed different, less polished, more tentative than her usual confident self. "Edward mentioned you've been planning your Italy trip," she said as I set the tea service down. "Yes, though it's still a few months away." I poured for both of us, adding a splash of milk to hers as she preferred. "Spring in Tuscany is supposed to be magnificent." She nodded, fidgeting with the corner of her portfolio. "That's actually why I'm here. She opened the leather case and removed several documents, sliding them across the table. "These are for you." I glanced down at the papers, then looked up in confusion. "What are these?" "Itineraries, hotel reservations, museum passes." She tapped the topmost page. "Edward and I have been working on it for weeks. We wanted to surprise you." My fingers trembled slightly as I picked up the documents. Each page detailed a different aspect of the trip: accommodations in small, charming hotels rather than impersonal chains, tickets for concerts in centuries-old churches, dinner reservations at family-owned trattorias off the tourist path. "This is extraordinarily thoughtful," I said, genuinely moved. "But you didn't need to go to such trouble." Vanessa's expression softened. "Actually, we did." She hesitated, then continued. "When Edward started volunteering at the shelter, something changed in him. He'd come home quieter, more reflective. One night, he told me about a man there who'd lost contact with his daughter years ago. The man kept her picture in his wallet, this faded school photo from when she was maybe 12. Vanessa's eyes glistened. "Edward said, 'I don't want to be that father. And I don't want Mom to be that mother either, carrying old pictures of us because the new ones don't include her.'" I swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in my throat. "So we decided," Vanessa continued, "that this trip shouldn't just be about checking off destinations on a bucket list. It should be about making new memories, taking new photos, ones where you're not behind the camera, but in the center of the frame." "We?" I asked softly. "Does that mean—" "Edward has already arranged time off work. Regina and Daniel are joining for the Tuscany portion. The twins have exams, so they can't miss too much school." She smiled. "It's all in the itinerary. We thought you might want to see what we've planned, in case you want to make changes." I looked down at the papers again, noticing details I'd missed. A cooking class in Bologna where we would learn to make pasta from scratch, a private boat tour of the Venetian lagoon, a day trip to the small coastal town where Harrison's grandparents had been born. "These are perfect," I whispered. "I wouldn't change a thing." After Vanessa left, I sat on my porch swing, watching the winter sun sink below the tree line, casting the frozen lake in shades of pink and gold. Harrison rested his head on my lap, his warm weight comforting against the February chill. I thought about what Vanessa had said, about making new memories, taking new photos. It wasn't just about being included in pictures, I realized. It was about being seen, truly seen, not as an obligation or an afterthought or even a source of inheritance, but as a person still very much alive, still creating, still part of the ongoing story of our family. The realization brought both joy and a sharper edge of sorrow for the years when I hadn't been seen. But perhaps those years had been necessary too, to bring us all to this moment of greater clarity. My phone chimed with a text from Regina. "Coming by tomorrow to discuss Italy details. Also, need your opinion on something for the workshop. My students want to design homeless shelters. Edward's influence, I assume." I smiled at the screen. My children were still finding their way. Back to themselves, back to each other, back to me. It wasn't a straight path. But when had family ever been simple? As promised, Regina arrived the next morning, bringing architectural drawings and a cinnamon coffee cake from the bakery I loved. Her usual brisk efficiency was tempered by something softer as she spread the drawings across my dining table. "These are from my workshop students," she explained, gesturing to the designs. "They've been working on concepts for dignified transitional housing." I studied the sketches with genuine interest. They showed thoughtful, innovative approaches to a difficult challenge, spaces that offered privacy, security, and a sense of home, however temporary. "These are remarkable," I said. "Your students are quite talented." Regina nodded, a hint of pride crossing her features. "They're mostly working adults, people who could never afford traditional architecture programs." a nurse who sketches hospital layouts in her spare time, a carpenter who's been building houses for 30 years but never had the chance to design one. They're lucky to have you as a teacher. She didn't acknowledge the compliment directly, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. One of them asked if we could make these designs real, find a way to actually build one of these concepts. And what did you tell them? That it would require funding, land, permits. She hesitated, but that I would look into possibilities. I hid my smile behind my coffee cup. This was so typically Regina, presenting the practical obstacles first, while already considering how to overcome them. Your firm has connections with developers, I suggested. Perhaps one might be interested in a project with social impact. She nodded, already scribbling notes. I've scheduled meetings with 2 of them next week. Then she glanced up, her expression uncertain. Do you think this is what Dad would have wanted? Using architecture this way? The question caught me off guard. Regina rarely spoke about Harrison anymore. The loss had been particularly acute. For her, the daddy's girl suddenly without her champion. Your father believed that every skill we possess is a tool for making the world better, I said carefully. He would be immensely proud to see you teaching others, using your expertise to address real needs. She was quiet for a long moment, tracing the outline of one of the drawings with her fingertip. I remember when I was 8 and Dad took me to that new library downtown, the one with the glass dome and reading nooks built into the walls. He told me that buildings could change how people feel, how they interact, how they see themselves in the world. She looked up, her eyes bright with memory. I decided that day I wanted to be an architect. I remember, I said softly. You came home and built a model library out of shoeboxes and construction paper. Harrison displayed it in his office for years. Did he? She seemed surprised. I didn't know that. There were many things your father did that you didn't see, little ways he supported and celebrated you both. I reached across the table to touch her hand. Just as there were many things I did that went unnoticed. Regina's expression faltered. I know that now, she admitted quietly. My students. They talk about their families, their struggles. Most of them are parents themselves, juggling so much to pursue this dream. It's made me think about all you managed alone after Dad died. I wasn't special, Regina, just a mother who loved her children. But that's just it. She met my gaze directly. You were special. You are special. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing that. The admission hung between us, fragile and precious. I didn't rush to fill the silence with reassurances or absolution. Some moments need to be felt completely, without dilution. Finally, Regina straightened her drawings with deliberate care. About the Italy trip. Edward mentioned you're planning to visit Dad's ancestral village? Yes, it's on the Ligurian coast. Quite small, probably not much to see, but it felt important. I've been researching it, she said, surprising me again. There's a family records office in the town hall. We might be able to find documents about great-grandparents, maybe even further back. You'd be interested in that? I asked carefully. I would. She hesitated, then added, I want my children to know where they come from. All of it. Not just the success stories, but the struggles too. The choices that led us here. I thought of the family photo from which I'd been excluded, and how that small but painful moment had led to this conversation. To my daughter reconnecting not just with me, but with her own history, her own values. That sounds perfect, I said. As winter gave way to early spring, the change in my children became more pronounced. Edward invited me to dinner at his home, but instead of the formal dining room where we usually gathered, he suggested a simple meal in the kitchen. When I arrived, I found him chopping vegetables, sleeves rolled up, classical music playing softly in the background. The kids are at Vanessa's parents' tonight, he explained, handing me a glass of wine. I thought we could just talk. I watched as he moved around the kitchen with surprising confidence, preparing a risotto with the focused attention he usually reserved for financial spreadsheets. "When did you learn to cook like this?" I asked. He smiled, a flash of boyish charm I hadn't seen in years. One of the men at the shelter, Carlos, was a chef before his restaurant closed during the pandemic. He's been teaching a few of us on Wednesday nights. He stirred the risotto, adding a ladle of broth. It's become this whole thing now, weekly cooking lessons in the shelter kitchen. That's wonderful, Edward. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. It started as just a way to help out, teaching job skills, you know? But it's become something else. Carlos says cooking is about patience, about transformation, taking simple ingredients and creating something greater than their sum. He looked up, meeting my eyes. Reminds me of parenting in a way. The comparison was so unexpected, so insightful that I felt my throat tighten with emotion. This was a side of Edward I hadn't seen in decades. The reflective, sensitive boy who had gradually disappeared beneath layers of ambition and responsibility. Over dinner, he told me more about his work at the shelter, about the community that was forming there. "We're looking at developing a transitional housing program," he said. "Something more substantial than emergency beds." "That sounds like something Regina might be interested in," I remarked. Her students have been designing similar concepts. Edward's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Really? She hasn't mentioned it?" "Perhaps you should ask her," I suggested. "It seems like an opportunity for collaboration." He considered this, nodding slowly. "I will. It's been a while since Reg and I worked on something together." He smiled ruefully. "Probably not, since that disastrous treehouse we tried to build for her twins." I laughed, remembering the lopsided structure that had prompted Regina to hire a professional carpenter to rescue the project. "You two have always had different approaches, but different doesn't mean incompatible." "No, it doesn't," he agreed. Then, with characteristic directness, he added, "Mom, I need to tell you something. I've been thinking about the changes you made to your will." I set down my fork, preparing myself for more conflict. "Yes?" "I want you to keep them in place. The conditions, the library donation, all of it." This was not what I had expected. "You do?" He nodded firmly. "When you first told us, I was angry. Felt like you were treating us like children who needed to be taught a lesson." He refilled our wine glasses, gathering his thoughts. "But that's exactly what I was. A grown man who had forgotten the most important lessons my parents ever taught me." "Edward," he held up a hand, asking me to let him finish. "The money you're leaving to the library, that matters. It will help thousands of children discover books the way I did when you used to take me there after school." His voice grew softer. "And the volunteer requirements. They're not punishment. They're opportunity. To reconnect with what matters. To use our privileges to make a difference." I studied my son's face, the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there a few years ago, the streaks of gray at his temples that reminded me so much of Harrison. "You've changed," I said simply. "I'm trying to," he acknowledged. "And I'm grateful. You gave me the push I needed." The weeks leading up to our Italy trip passed in a flurry of preparation and unexpected moments of connection. Regina called to ask if I would speak to her architecture students about the historic buildings of Tuscany. Edward invited me to help prepare a special dinner at the shelter, where I taught Harrison's recipe for beef stew to a group of men eager to learn cooking skills for future employment. Vanessa organized a shopping trip for travel essentials, insisting I needed comfortable walking shoes and a quality camera, so you can take pictures of us for a change. Daniel, Regina's husband, spent a Saturday installing safety features in my cottage, grab bars in the bathroom, motion-sensing lights along the pathway to the door, not because he thought me incapable, but because, as he put it, "We want you to enjoy this place for many years to come. Even my grandchildren became more present in my life. Jacob, now in his first year of college, began calling weekly to discuss the European history course he was taking in preparation for our trip. Regina's twins helped me create a digital scrapbook of family photos, including many I'd forgotten. Existed. Snapshots of beach vacations, holiday gatherings, ordinary moments that strung together told the story of our family. "Look at this one, Grandma," 15-year-old Lily said, pointing to a faded Polaroid of Regina as a toddler, sitting on Harrison's shoulders at a park. "Mom looks so happy." "She was," I said, smiling at the memory. "Your grandfather used to call her his sky girl, because she always wanted to be lifted up to see everything from above." "Is that why Mom became an architect?" Lily asked. "To design tall buildings?" I'd never considered the connection before, but it made a certain poetic sense. Perhaps it was. Sometimes our earliest joys shape our deepest purposes. The night. Before our departure for Italy, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my living room, Harrison's warm presence at my feet, looking through the family album the twins had created. Page after page of memories, some joyful, some bittersweet, all precious. And at the very end, a blank section titled Italy 2025, New Adventures. I thought about the journey we were about to take, not just across an ocean, but back to each other. Back to the values that had shaped us before success and security became our primary concerns. It wouldn't be perfect. Old habits and hurts wouldn't disappear overnight. But we were moving forward together, eyes open, hearts more receptive than they had been in years. My gaze fell on a photo I hadn't seen in decades. Harrison holding newborn Edward, while 3-year-old Regina peered curiously at her baby brother. Harrison's expression was one of pure wonder, a glimpse of the father he would become in the few precious years he had left. "We did all right, didn't we?" I whispered to his image. "They lost their way for a while, but they're finding it again." And in that quiet moment, surrounded by memories and anticipation of new ones yet to be made, I felt a profound sense of peace. Not because my children had completely transformed overnight, nor because our family had been magically healed of all its fractures, but because we were all, in our own ways, learning to see each other clearly again, as flawed, complex individuals worthy of love and respect, not just for what we could provide, but for who we truly were. Italy awaited us, its ancient cities, and timeless landscapes the perfect backdrop for a family rediscovering itself. And when we stood together for photos in the piazzas of Rome, the hillsides of Tuscany, the canals of Venice, I would be there in the center of the frame. Not because I had demanded it, but because they had invited me back into the picture. The family photo that had started this journey, the one from which I'd been excluded, now seemed like a distant memory, important not for the hurt it had caused, but for the healing it had ultimately inspired. Sometimes, I reflected, it takes a moment of painful clarity to illuminate the path forward. As dawn broke over the lake, casting my cottage in the gentle light of a new day, I finally felt ready for sleep. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of our journey, not just to Italy, but toward becoming the family we were always meant to be. A family that honors its past while creating its future. A family that sees and celebrates each member, regardless of age or circumstance. And for me, Dorothea Pendlewick, 72 years young, with Harrison's golden retriever namesake snoring softly beside me and a suitcase packed for adventures yet to come. This was not an ending, but a beautiful, unexpected second beginning. Italy embraced us with ancient arms of stone and sunlight. Our first morning in Rome dawned with perfect clarity, the spring air carrying the scent of espresso and fresh bread from the cafe below our hotel windows. I woke before the others, drawn to the small balcony overlooking a courtyard where an elderly man was carefully sweeping the cobblestones, pausing occasionally to exchange greetings with early morning passers-by. There was something in his unhurried movements, his evident pride in this small corner of the world that reminded me of my late husband. "You would have loved this, Harrison," I whispered, leaning against the wrought iron railing. The rising sun cast long shadows across the weathered buildings, their terracotta and ochre facades glowing with a warmth that seemed to reach across centuries. A soft knock at my door interrupted my reverie. Regina stood in the hallway, already dressed, in comfortable walking shoes and a light jacket, her usually sleek hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. The sight was so unlike her customary polished appearance that I momentarily faltered. "Too early?" she asked, misinterpreting my surprise. "Not at all," I replied, stepping aside to welcome her. "I've been up watching the neighborhood wake." She joined me on the balcony, her posture relaxing as she took in the scene below. "It's nothing like Boston, is it? Everything here feels so lived in." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The buildings surrounding us had weathered wars, plagues, revolutions, had witnessed countless human dramas unfold beneath their windows. Yet they remained, steadfast and dignified, embracing each new generation. "Dad would have spent hours just sketching these streets," Regina said quietly, and I felt a small surge of joy at her willingness to speak of Harrison so naturally. "Remember how he always carried that little notebook? He filled dozens of them," I confirmed. "I still have them all." She turned to me, eyes widening slightly. "You do?" I thought, when we cleared out the house. "I couldn't part with them," I admitted. "They're in a cedar chest at the cottage. His handwriting, his drawings, they were too precious to let go." Regina was silent for a moment, her gaze returning to the courtyard below. "I'd like to see them someday, if that's all right." "Of course," I said simply, not trusting myself with more words. We stood together in comfortable silence until Edward and the others joined us, and our first day in Rome began in earnest. Edward had arranged for a local guide, not one who would rush us through crowded tourist sites, but a university professor of art history who specialized in the hidden corners of the Eternal City. Professor Bianchi was a small, vibrant woman in her 60s, with silver-streaked black hair and quick, expressive hands. "Rome reveals herself slowly," she told us as we walked. "The greatest treasures are often the ones you discover when you're not looking for them." She led us down narrow side streets and through forgotten courtyards, showing us ancient columns incorporated into medieval buildings, Renaissance fountains tucked away in quiet piazzas, and tiny chapels with masterpieces that never made the guidebooks. Throughout the day, I noticed my children absorbing the experience differently than they might have months ago. Edward, normally impatient with sightseeing, listened attentively to Professor Bianchi's stories about the families who had shaped Rome's destiny. Regina, who would typically focus on architectural details, seemed equally interested in the human histories behind the buildings. At a small trattoria for lunch, tucked away from the tourist crowds, Vanessa insisted on taking a photo of me with both my children. As we posed together beneath a pergola draped with flowering vines, I felt Edward's arms secure around my shoulders, Regina's hand resting lightly on mine. "Smile, Mom," Edward said softly, and the simple request, so different from being asked to step behind the camera, brought warmth to my chest. After lunch, as we wandered through an ancient neighborhood, Jacob fell into step beside me. "Grandma, can I ask you something?" "Of course, dear." He hesitated, glancing ahead to where his parents walked with Regina and Daniel. "The conditions in your will, about volunteer service before getting my inheritance, did you really mean that?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered how my grandchildren might view the changes I'd made. "I did," I answered. "Honestly." "Does that upset you?" Jacob shook his head slowly. "Actually, I think it's kind of brilliant." "You do?" He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "In my economics class, we're studying how wealth transfers between generations, the Professor talked about how inheritances without purpose can sometimes do more harm than good. I raised an eyebrow. And what do you think? I think... He paused, choosing his words carefully. I think money is just a tool. It can build things or destroy them, depending on who's holding it and why. He glanced at me. Dad's different. Since he started working at the shelter. Happier, somehow. Less stressed, even though he's doing more. I squeezed his arm gently. That's very perceptive, Jacob. So yeah, he continued. I think it's right, making us earn it through service. It's like you're teaching us what the money is actually for. From the mouth of babes, I thought, amazed at the wisdom in my grandson's words. At 19, he already understood something it had taken me decades to fully grasp, that wealth is not merely something to be accumulated, but a responsibility to be wielded thoughtfully. That evening, after a dinner of pasta and local wine, we gathered in the hotel's courtyard garden. The night air was soft with spring, and small lights twinkled in the trees overhead. Edward had brought his laptop to show us the pictures from our first day, projecting them onto a white wall. Image after image appeared, the 7 of us exploring ancient streets, laughing over lunch, gazing up at forgotten masterpieces. And in each one, I was there, sometimes at the center, sometimes at the edge, but always present. Always part of the story being told. One photo in particular caught my breath. Regina and I standing before a Renaissance painting of a mother and daughter. The resemblance between us in the photo, the same slight tilt of the head, the same thoughtful expression, mirrored the subjects in the ancient artwork. It was as if time had folded back on itself, revealing patterns of connection that transcended generations. That's my favorite, Edward said quietly, noticing my reaction. Like looking at 2 sets of mirrors across time. As the days in Rome gave way to our journey into Tuscany, I found myself watching my children rediscover not just Italy, but each other. Regina and Edward, who had grown increasingly distant over the years of focusing on their separate careers, and families began to reconnect through shared experiences and memories. Remember when Dad tried to make authentic Italian pizza after we watched that cooking show? Regina asked one evening as we sat in a vineyard outside Florence, the hills around us bathed in golden sunset light. Edward laughed, the sound carefree, in a way I hadn't heard in years. The smoke alarm went off and the neighbors thought our house was on fire. The fire department showed up, Regina continued, her eyes dancing with mirth. And Dad offered them all slices of his burnt creation. And they ate it, I added, the memory vivid and sweet. They were too kind to refuse. That was Dad, Edward said, his voice softening. He could charm anyone. Even the fire chief who was supposed to be writing him a citation, Regina agreed. As they traded stories back and forth, some I remembered well, others that were new to me, glimpses of sibling experiences I hadn't been privy to, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. They were reclaiming not just their connection to each other, but to the fuller truth of who their father had been, who I was, who we all were as a family. In Florence, we visited the great museums, of course, stood before Michelangelo's David and Botticelli's Venus, marveled at the dome of the Duomo, but it was the smaller moments that embedded themselves most deeply in my heart. Regina sitting beside me on a bench in the Boboli Gardens, sketching the same vista that Harrison had drawn decades ago during our honeymoon. Edward teaching his youngest child how to toss a coin into the Trevi fountain, his patience and tenderness reminding me so much of Harrison with toddler Edward. Daniel and Vanessa organizing a surprise renewal of vows for their 15th anniversary, inviting us all to witness their recommitment in a tiny chapel fragrant with lilies and candlelight. And through it all, photographs, hundreds of them. No longer was I the forgotten figure behind the camera. Now Edward's oldest, Jacob, had taken on the role of family documentarian, his artist's eye capturing moments both grand and intimate. When I looked through his images each evening, I saw my family through his perspective. Connected, engaged, present with each other in ways they hadn't been for years. "You have a gift," I told Jacob one morning as we waited for the others in a cafe. "These photos tell stories." He ducked his head, pleased but embarrassed by the praise. "I'm just trying to capture how it feels, not just how it looks." "That's exactly what makes them special," I assured him. "Anyone can take a picture of a building or a sunset. You're capturing the experience of being there, of being together." He nodded, then hesitated before asking, Would you teach me how to use those old film cameras when we get home? The ones from when you were a photographer?" I stared at him, startled. "How did you know I used to be a photographer?" "Dad told me. He said before you became a librarian, you worked for a local newspaper, that you were really good, but gave it up to raise him and Aunt Regina after Grandpa died." He looked at me with genuine curiosity. "Why didn't you ever talk about that?" The question pierced me unexpectedly. Why hadn't I? Because somewhere along the way, I'd started defining myself solely through my roles as mother, widow, librarian, forgetting the young woman with a camera and dreams of her own. Just as my children had eventually stopped seeing me as a complete person, I had perhaps stopped seeing myself that way too. "I suppose I thought it wasn't important anymore," I admitted. "But I'd love to teach you. I still have my old Nikon somewhere in the cottage." His face lit up. "Really? That would be awesome." The conversation left me thoughtful for the rest of the day as we explored Florence. Had I contributed to my own erasure from the family picture by gradually setting aside the parts of myself that existed beyond motherhood? It wasn't that I regretted the choices I'd made. Raising Edward and Regina after Harrison's death had been my priority, and rightfully so. But perhaps I had allowed those roles to consume me so completely that, when my children no longer needed me in the same way, I was left without a clear sense of who I was apart from them. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I opened my laptop and searched my own name along with Millfield Gazette, the small newspaper where I'd worked in my 20s. To my surprise, several results appeared, digitized archives from the local Historical Society. I clicked on the first link, and there it was, a photo credit beneath a striking black and white image of civil rights protesters marching through our town square in 1968. Photograph by Dorothea Pendlewick. I spent the next hour scrolling through more archives, rediscovering my own work. Documentation of town meetings, school events, local personalities, moments of community triumph and struggle. The young woman who had captured these images had been passionate, observant, connected to her community in a way that went beyond mere documentation. She had seen people, truly seen them, and preserved their dignity and humanity through her lens. When had I stopped seeing myself with that same clarity and compassion? The question followed me into our next destination, Venice, city of water and light, of reflections and illusions. As our water taxi carried us along the Grand Canal, past palaces that seemed to float on the lagoon's surface, I found myself studying the play of sunlight on the ancient facades, the way reality and its reflection merged and separated with each ripple of water. "It's like the city is having a conversation with itself," I murmured, not realizing I'd spoken aloud until Regina, seated beside me, responded. "That's exactly it," she said, her gaze following mine across the water. "The reflection both is and isn't the building. It's a kind of dialogue between what's solid and what's fluid." I looked at my daughter with fresh appreciation. Despite the professional distance she often maintained, there was a poetic soul beneath her practical exterior, one that I hadn't acknowledged often enough. "You see beauty in structure," I observed. "That's a rare gift." She seemed startled by the comment, then thoughtful. "I suppose I do. Though lately I've been thinking more about the purpose of structure, how buildings shape the lives within them." She hesitated. "Those homeless shelter designs my students created. I've been talking to investors about actually building one. Regina, that's wonderful. She nodded, a mixture of excitement and uncertainty in her expression. It's different from the commercial projects I usually work on. Less profitable, more complicated, but also more meaningful somehow. Because it matters, I said simply. Yes. She met my eyes directly. Like those photographs you used to take. They mattered too, didn't they? The question caught me off guard. How did you know about that? Jacob mentioned it. I was surprised. I didn't remember you being a photographer. She looked away, watching the Venetian skyline drift by. It made me realize how many parts of you I never knew, or forgot, or simply didn't pay attention to. The admission hung between us, honest and painful and necessary. We all have our blind spots, I said gently. I probably haven't seen you completely either. She nodded, accepting this. Maybe that's what we're doing here, learning to see each other again, more fully. In Venice, our days fell into a pleasant rhythm. Mornings exploring the city's treasures, the grandeur of St. Mark's, the artistic masterpieces of the Accademia, the fascinating craftsmanship of Murano glass. Afternoons wandering through less-traveled neighborhoods, discovering local baccari where Venetians gathered for sacchetti and conversation. Evenings together over long dinners, sharing discoveries and memories, planning the next day's adventures. On our third evening, Edward arranged a private gondola tour of the smaller canals at sunset. As our gondolier guided us through narrow waterways where buildings centuries old leaned toward each other across the water, I found myself seated between my two children, their spouses and children in gondolas behind us. This is the Venice tourists rarely see, our guide explained in accented English, gesturing toward washing hanging from windows, small shrines built into corners, children playing in tiny courtyards. The living city behind the postcard. As we drifted beneath a stone bridge, a young couple leaned over the railing above, their silhouettes outlined against the deepening blue of the sky. The woman's laughter echoed off the water, a sound of pure joy that made us all smile in response. Remember when we were that young? Edward asked, his voice soft with nostalgia. Speak for yourself, I retorted. I'm still that young at heart. He laughed, putting his arm around my shoulders. Yes, you are, Mom. That's what I've been realizing on this trip. You're not the fragile old lady I was treating you as. You're still the woman who taught me to ride a bike, who worked 3 jobs to put us through college, who never once let us see how scared you must have been after Dad died. I was terrified, I admitted, the confession easier here, in this floating city between reality and dream. Every single day. But you kept going, Regina said. You built a life for us, for yourself, out of that fear. That's what parents do, I said simply. Not all parents, Edward countered. Some break, some run, some turn bitter. He looked at me directly. You could have, after losing Dad so young. No one would have blamed you. I thought about those difficult years, the crushing loneliness of empty evenings after the children were asleep, the panic of financial decisions I'd never had to make before, the exhaustion of being both mother and father to 2 grieving children while managing my own grief. There were moments when I wanted to, I confessed, times when it all felt impossible. What kept you going? Regina asked, and I heard in her question the architect's mind seeking the foundation, the supporting structure beneath the visible surface. I considered my answer carefully. Love, partially, for you both, for the life your father and I had built, but also. I paused, finding words for something I'd never fully articulated before. Also, a kind of stubborn insistence that our story wasn't over yet, that his death was a terrible chapter, but not the end of the book. As our gondola rounded a bend, the narrow canal suddenly opened onto the Grand Canal just as the setting sun turned the water to liquid gold. The beauty of the moment, The perfect light, the ancient city, my children beside me, struck me with such force that tears sprang to my eyes. And it wasn't, I whispered. The end, I mean. Look at us now. Here in the city Harrison always dreamed of visiting, together after all these years. He would have loved this moment so much. Edward took my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. He's here with us, Mom. In the stories we've been sharing, in the way you raised us, in who we all became because of him, and because of you. Our gondolier, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, began to sing softly, an old Venetian love song that seemed to rise from the water itself, a melody that had echoed through these same canals for generations. As his voice carried across the water, I looked back at the gondolas behind us, where my grandchildren were leaning forward, captivated by the music and the moment. This, I thought, is what legacy truly means. Not just what we leave behind in wills and trusts, but what lives on in memories shared, values transmitted, moments of beauty experienced together. And in that understanding, I found a peace that had eluded me since that first excluded family photo had revealed how invisible I had become. Here, reflected in the waters of Venice and in the eyes of my family, I was seen completely. My past, my present and the future that still stretched before me, full of possibility. The final leg of our Italian journey brought us to the small coastal village of Portovenere, the place where Harrison's grandparents had lived before emigrating to America in the early 1900s. Unlike Rome's grandeur, Florence's artistic splendor, or Venice's ethereal beauty, Portovenere offered a different kind of magic, the authentic rhythm of life in a seaside town largely untouched by time. Our hotel perched on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean, its terrace providing views that stretched across the sparkling azure water to distant islands. On our first morning, I woke early and slipped out onto the balcony, breathing in the salt-laden air and watching fishing boats return with their morning catch. Far below, an older woman dressed in black swept the steps outside her door, pausing occasionally to exchange words with neighbors beginning their day. "This is it," I whispered to myself. "This is where Harrison came from." I could feel him, here more strongly than anywhere else we'd visited. Not in grand monuments or famous artworks, but in the character of this place and its people. The unhurried pace, the emphasis on quality over quantity, the deep reverence for both tradition and beauty. All the traits I had loved most in my husband seemed embodied in this small village clinging to the edge of the sea. After breakfast, we set out to explore the narrow streets that wound between colorful buildings stacked against the hillside. Our first destination was the town hall, where Regina had arranged an appointment with the local records office. The building was modest, but well-maintained, its interior cool and quiet compared to the warming spring day outside. The archivist, who greeted us, a dignified man named Signor Rossi, seemed genuinely pleased by our interest in our family connections. Pendlewick, he mused, rolling the unfamiliar surname around in his mouth. Ah, but the original name was Pendolini, yes? Many names changed when families crossed the ocean. Edward nodded. Our grandfather mentioned that once. The immigration officers at Ellis Island simplified it. Americans, Signor Rossi said with a good-natured sigh. Always in such a hurry, even with names that have served families for centuries. But his eyes twinkled as he spoke, taking any sting from his words. Come, I have prepared some documents for you to examine. He led us to a small reading room where several leather-bound volumes and folders of yellowed papers were arranged on a large table. With reverent hands, he opened the first book to a marked page. Here, he said, pointing to an entry written in faded ink. The marriage record of Giuseppe Pendolini and Maria Conti, 1897. These would be your great-grandparents, yes? I leaned forward, my heart quickening at the sight of the graceful handwriting recording this moment from over a century ago. Harrison's grandparents, I confirmed. They came to America just after their first child was born. Signor Rossi nodded, turning to another document. "And here is the birth record of that child, Antonio Pendolini, born January 12th, 1898. He glanced up. "Your husband's father?" "His father, yes," I said softly, reaching out to touch the edge of the paper, feeling a tangible connection to my late father-in-law, whom I had only known briefly before his own passing. Harrison would have loved to see this. "Nono always talked about this place," Jacob said, using the Italian term for grandfather, though Harrison had died before he was born. Even though he'd never been here himself. The memory of home can be very strong, even when carried across generations, Signor Rossi observed, turning to another folder. "Now, this might interest you particularly. These are photographs of the town from that period." He carefully spread several black and white photographs across the table. Images of the harbor filled with fishing boats, of women hanging laundry between buildings, of children playing in the town square, of men repairing nets along the waterfront. The town photographer was quite dedicated, Signor Rossi explained. He documented daily life here for nearly 40 years. As we examined the photographs, I felt a strange kinship with this unknown photographer from the past. He had seen these people, had recognized the dignity in their ordinary lives, had preserved moments that would otherwise have been lost to time. It was exactly what I had tried to do in my own brief career as a newspaper photographer. "Look," Regina said suddenly, pointing to a group portrait of what appeared to be a fishing crew standing proudly beside their boat. "Third from the left, doesn't he look exactly like Dad?" We all leaned closer, and I felt a jolt of recognition. The young man in the photograph, though dressed in century-old clothing, bore an uncanny resemblance to Harrison. The same strong jaw, the same slight tilt of the head, even a similar half-smile. "Giuseppe Pendolini with his crew, 1896, Signor Rossi read from the caption. "So this would be your husband's grandfather." "The resemblance is remarkable," Edward said, his voice hushed with wonder. "It's like looking at Dad as a young man." "Blood speaks across generations," Signor Rossi nodded sagely. "In face, in gesture, in character. This is why family is so important. We carry those who came before us, always." We spent the morning immersed in these records, piecing together fragments of our family's story. We learned that the Pendolinis had been fishermen for generations, respected in the community for their skill and honesty. That Maria had been a talented seamstress whose wedding veils were sought after throughout the region. That they had left Italy reluctantly, driven by economic necessity rather than desire for adventure. They maintained connections here for many years, Signor Rossi told us, showing letters that had been preserved in the town archives. Giuseppe's younger brother remained in Porto Venere, and they corresponded until Giuseppe's death in 1952. "Do any Pendolinis still live here?" Regina asked. Signor Rossi shook his head regretfully. "The last direct descendant died in the 1980s. But there are cousins through the Conti side, Maria's family. In fact..." He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "The woman who owns the small restaurant near the church, Sofia Beneventi, she is a distant cousin of yours. Her grandmother was Maria's niece." Edward's eyebrows rose in surprise. "We have family here, living relatives." "Distant family," Signor Rossi qualified. "But yes, Sofia knows of the American branch of the family, though I don't believe there has been contact for many decades." I felt a sudden, powerful urge to connect with this unknown relative, to complete the circle that had begun when Giuseppe and Maria left these shores over a century ago. Would you introduce us?" I asked. Signor Rossi smiled warmly. "It would be my pleasure, Signora Pendlewick. Sofia serves the best seafood in town. We can arrange to have lunch there today, if you wish." And so, after copying several documents and photographs to take home with us, we made our way to a small, whitewashed building near the 12th century church that stood guard over the harbor. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Trattoria Beneventi," and flower boxes filled with geraniums brightened the windows. Signor Rossi had called ahead, so when we entered, a woman in her early 60s approached us immediately, her dark sea eyes curious and welcoming. She bore no obvious resemblance to Harrison or his father, but there was something in the graceful way she carried herself that seemed vaguely familiar. "Buongiorno," she greeted us, her gaze moving from face to face, with keen interest. "Signor Rossi tells me we are family." After introductions and explanations, Sophia insisted on closing the restaurant to other customers. Family is more important than business today, and serving us a feast of local specialties prepared by her own hands. Course after course appeared: anchovies marinated in lemon, pasta with fresh pesto, mussels steamed with white wine and herbs, grilled sea bass caught that morning by her nephew. With each dish came stories of growing up in this village, of the grandparents and great-grandparents who had passed down these recipes, of the connection to the sea that defined life in Porto Venere. My grandmother always spoke of her cousin, Maria, who went to America, Sophia told us as she poured more wine. She kept the letters, read them to us children. America seemed like another world, so far away, so different. But she always said, "Remember, we have family there. We are not just from this small place." And now that family has returned, I said, raising my glass to her. Sophia's eyes glistened slightly. "It is good to complete the circle," she agreed, "to know that the branches of the family tree still recognize each other, even after so much time." After lunch, Sophia closed the restaurant for the afternoon, a decision only the owner can make, and offered to show us places connected to our shared family history. She led us through winding streets to a small house where Giuseppe and Maria had lived before emigrating, now owned by tourists from Milan who used it as a summer home. She showed us the church where they had been married, its interior cool and reverent, scented with incense and centuries of prayers. And finally, she took us to the harbor where they had departed for America, leaving behind everything familiar to create a new life. "They were brave," she said as we stood looking out at the water, "to leave such beauty, such history, for an uncertain future." "But they carried this place with them," I replied, "in their hearts, in their stories. Harrison's father passed, those stories to him, and he to our children. The connection was never truly broken." Sophia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And now you bring the stories back to where they began." That evening, our last in Italy, we gathered on the hotel terrace for dinner. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the water, silhouetting the ancient church against a sky painted in shades of amber and rose. Sophia had joined us at our invitation, bringing bottles of her family's homemade limoncello and stories that kept us laughing and sometimes tearful through the meal. As twilight deepened into night and stars appeared, above the darkening sea, Jacob set up his camera to take a group photograph. Our family plus Sophia, our newly discovered Italian cousin. We arranged ourselves with the illuminated village as backdrop, arms around each other, faces flushed with good food, wine, and the warm glow of connection. "Everyone ready?" Jacob called, setting the timer and hurrying to join us. In that moment, just before the shutter clicked, I felt Harrison's presence so strongly it was almost tangible, as if he had somehow joined us in this photograph, completing our family circle across the boundaries of time and distance, and even death itself. The camera flashed, capturing us all together, the living embodiment of Giuseppe and Maria's legacy, the fruition of their difficult decision to leave this beautiful place in search of opportunity. We had returned, carrying with us the stories and traits and DNA that connected us to this village and its people. "To family," Edward proposed, raising his glass. "Past, present, and future." "To family," we echoed, the words seeming to ripple outward across the dark water and up into the star-filled sky. Later that night, unable to sleep, I sat alone on my balcony, listening to the gentle rhythm of waves against the shore far below. Tomorrow we would begin our journey home, back to responsibilities and routines, to the everyday realities we had temporarily set aside. But we would return changed, carrying with us not just memories and photographs, but a deeper understanding of ourselves and each other. The cottage by the lake awaited me, no longer a symbol of rebellion against my children's attempts to manage my life, but a true home where I could continue to grow and create in this new chapter of my life. And my children would return to their own homes with, I hoped, a clearer vision of who I was, who they were, who we all were together. My thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at my door. Opening it, I found Regina standing in the hallway, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the night's chill. "May I join you?" she asked. "I saw your light was still on." I stepped aside to welcome her, and we settled on the balcony, sharing the comfortable silence of night in a sleeping village. After a while, Regina spoke, her voice soft but clear in the darkness. "I've been thinking about those photographs in the town archives, the ones taken by that local photographer a century ago. Ordinary moments of daily life that would have been lost if he hadn't seen their value." I nodded, though I wasn't sure she could see the gesture in the dim light. "It reminds me of what you used to do," she continued. "Jacob showed me some of your old newspaper photographs that he found. Online. They were beautiful, Mom. You really saw people, captured their dignity, their humanity." "Thank you," I said simply, touched by her recognition of that long dormant part of myself. "Why did you stop?" she asked. "After Dad died, I mean. You could have continued with photography." I considered the question carefully before answering. "Partly necessity. I needed the stability of a librarian's salary and schedule to raise you both. But partly, I think I lost sight of myself for a while. All my creative energy went into holding our family together." "Do you regret that?" "Not for a moment," I said firmly. "You and Edward were always my priority, and I wouldn't change that. But perhaps I didn't need to set that part of myself aside so completely." Regina was quiet for a time, and when she spoke again, her voice held a note of confession. "I was angry when you changed your will. I felt like you were punishing us, trying to control us from beyond the grave." She turned to face me, her profile silvered by starlight. "But I understand better now. You weren't just thinking about money or property. You were trying to preserve something more important." "Values," I said. "Connection, purpose, the things that make a life meaningful." "Yes." She reached over and took my hand, her grip firm and warm. "The architecture workshops I've been teaching, they've changed how I think about my work. These students bring such different perspectives, such genuine passion. They're not designing to win awards or impress clients. They're trying to solve real problems, to make spaces where people can thrive." "That sounds fulfilling." "It is," she admitted. "More than I expected. We're actually moving forward with one of the shelter designs, a pilot project in collaboration with Edward's volunteer group. The city has donated land, and we've secured initial funding." "Regina, that's wonderful," I said, genuinely proud of this unexpected collaboration between my children. "It's preliminary," she cautioned, ever the pragmatist. "Many hurdles to clear." "But—" She hesitated, then continued with rare vulnerability. "It feels right, Mom. Like I'm using my skills for something that matters, not just adding to my portfolio." I squeezed her hand. "Your father would be so proud of you, of both of you." "I hope so." She was silent for a moment, then asked, "Do you think he would approve of how I've lived my life? The choices I've made?" The question revealed a depth of uncertainty I hadn't realized my accomplished daughter still carried. "Harrison was never one to measure success by conventional standards," I said carefully. "He valued integrity, kindness, the courage to forge your own path. By those measures, yes, I think he would be immensely proud of you. She nodded, accepting this. And you, Mom? Are you proud of us? Always, I said without hesitation. Not just for what you've achieved, but for who you are, and especially for who you're becoming. We sat together in companionable silence, the distant sound of waves a gentle counterpoint to our thoughts. After a while, Regina spoke again, her voice reflective. When you were excluded from that family photo at Jacob's graduation, how did it make you feel? Really feel, I mean. The directness of the question took me by surprise, but I answered, honestly, invisible, as if all the years I'd devoted to our family counted for nothing, as if I'd already ceased to exist in your minds. She winced visibly at my words. I'm sorry. We were thoughtless, not malicious. But that doesn't make it better. I know that now, I assured her. And in a strange way, that moment was a gift. It forced me to see how things had shifted, how I needed to reclaim my place, not just in family photographs, but in my own life. The cottage, the dog, the trip. The changes to my will, I added with a small smile. She acknowledged, this with a rueful nod. A wake-up call for all of us. Sometimes we need those, I observed. Moments that jolt us out of complacency, that make us question the stories we've been telling ourselves. Regina looked out at the starlit sea, her expression thoughtful. I've been telling myself a story that success means one thing: prestige, recognition, financial security. But there are other measures, aren't there? Many, I agreed. The quality of our relationships, the positive impact we have on others, the alignment between our values and our actions. The legacy we leave, she added softly. Yes, but not just what we leave behind when we're gone. The legacy we create each day, we're alive. She turned to me, her face serious in the dim light. I want you to know something, Mom. When we get home, Daniel and I are changing our will too. Oh? I kept my tone neutral, curious rather than concerned. We're establishing scholarship. Funds for both twins' future inheritances. They'll manage foundations that will help disadvantaged students pursue architecture and medical careers. She smiled slightly. With similar service requirements to what you established, the structure will ensure they use their privilege thoughtfully. I felt a rush of emotion at this revelation. Pride, yes, but also profound relief. Regina hadn't just accepted the changes I'd made. She'd embraced the underlying values and was extending them to the next generation. That sounds perfect, I said, my voice slightly unsteady. It's what Dad would have wanted, she said simply. And it's what I want too. For my children to understand that wealth brings responsibility, that their actions should align with their values. As we sat together beneath the Italian stars, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't experienced since Harrison's death. Not an ending. There was still so much life to be lived, so many experiences ahead. But a circle closing, a pattern revealing itself across generations. In the quiet village of Harrison's ancestors, I had found not just connection to the past, but renewed hope for the future. My children were reclaiming the values that had shaped our family, interpreting them in their own ways for a new era. The legacy continued, not through blind inheritance, but through conscious choice. And I, Dorothea Pendlewick, was fully present for this unfolding story, not as a footnote or an afterthought, but as an active participant with my own ongoing journey. I had reclaimed my voice, my passions, my rightful place in the center of my own life. The young woman who had once captured moments of truth through her camera lens had returned, older, but no less observant, no less engaged with the world around her. The mother who had devoted herself to raising her children had fulfilled that sacred task without losing herself in the process. The widow who had carried her husband's memory had honored that love while continuing to grow and change. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, casting the first pale glow over the sleeping village, I made a silent promise to myself to live these coming years with the same courage and clarity that had carried me through the difficult ones after Harrison's death. To remain visible, to my children, to my grandchildren, to myself, not through demands or conditions, but through genuine engagement with my own life and theirs. The family photograph from which I had been excluded now seemed like a distant memory, important not for the hurt it had caused, but for the awakening it had inspired. Sometimes, I reflected as the first golden rays of sun touched the ancient walls of Porto Venera. We need to be removed from the picture to realize we've been framing it wrong all along. Returning home after 3 weeks in Italy felt like stepping into a familiar room where all the furniture had been subtly rearranged, everything recognizable yet somehow transformed by our shared experiences abroad. My cottage by the lake welcomed me with the eager greeting of Harrison the dog, who had been lovingly cared for by my neighbor Mrs. Keller, and the comforting embrace of spaces shaped by my own choices, not others' expectations. But I returned to it with new eyes, seeing not just a declaration of independence, but a canvas for this next chapter of my life. The first morning back, I woke early, my body still operating on European time. Rather than fighting the insomnia, I embraced it, brewing coffee and taking it out to the porch swing where Harrison settled at my feet. The lake was still in the pre-dawn stillness, mist hovering just above the water's surface, the first birds beginning their morning conversations in the surrounding trees. As I watched the sun slowly illuminate the eastern sky, painting the clouds in delicate watercolor hues, I felt a clarity of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. This small, perfect moment, the warmth of the mug in my hands, the weight of Harrison's head against my ankles, the gradual awakening of the world around me, seemed to crystallize everything I had learned during our journey. Life wasn't measured in grand gestures or ambitious achievements, but in these quiet instances of presence and connection, and I was determined to fill whatever years remained to me with such moments, fully inhabited, deeply appreciated. That resolution didn't mean withdrawing from the world or from my family. Quite the opposite. I wanted to engage more meaningfully, to create spaces where genuine connection could flourish. I began with small gestures, inviting my neighbor Mrs. Keller for weekly tea, volunteering at the local animal shelter where Harrison had been adopted, joining a book club at the Millfield Library where I had worked for so many years. But the most significant change came from an unexpected source. A week after our return, Jacob appeared at my door, a vintage camera case in his hands. "Found this in Dad's attic," he said, holding it out to me. "Is this yours?" I recognized the worn leather case immediately, my old Nikon F2, the camera I had used during my years as a newspaper photographer. I hadn't seen it in decades, had assumed it lost in one of our many moves after Harrison's death. "May I?" I asked, reaching for it with fingers that trembled slightly. Jacob handed it over, watching curiously as I unlatched the case and lifted out the camera. It was heavier than I remembered, solid and mechanical in a way that digital cameras never are. I raised it to my eye, the familiar action awakening muscle memories long dormant, and looked through the viewfinder. The world immediately transformed, framed, focused, waiting to be captured. "Does it still work?" Jacob asked. I lowered the camera, turning it in my hands to examine it. "I'm not sure. It would need film for one thing, and I don't know if the mechanics are still functioning after all these years. Can we find out?" His enthusiasm was infectious. I meant what I said in Italy. I want to learn how to use it. That afternoon, we drove into town and found a specialty photography shop that still carried 35mm film. The owner, a bearded man in his 30s named Elliot, was delighted to see my vintage Nikon. "They don't make them like this anymore," he said reverently, handling the camera with expert care. Built to last generations. He checked various components, made a few minor adjustments, and pronounced it in remarkably good condition. The light meter will need a new battery, and the shutter could use a professional cleaning, but it's definitely usable. We left with several rolls of black and white film, a new battery for the light meter, and Elliot's card with an invitation to bring the camera back once we'd shot some test images. In the car, Jacob could barely contain his excitement. "What should we photograph first?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. Something meaningful, not just a test subject. He nodded, understanding immediately. "The lake? From your porch at sunset?" "Perfect," I agreed. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Jacob and I sat on my porch with the Nikon between us. I showed him how to load the film, how to set the aperture and shutter speed, how to focus manually using the split prism viewfinder. His digital photography experience gave him a solid foundation, but there was something almost ceremonial about teaching him these analog skills, a passing of knowledge across generations, a connection to a way of seeing that predated the instant gratification of digital imaging. As the golden hour light bathed the lake in warm radiance, we took turns with the camera, capturing the changing light, the texture of ripples on the water, the silhouettes of trees against the darkening sky. The deliberate nature of film photography, knowing each frame was precious, that we couldn't immediately review our results, brought an intensity of focus that felt both familiar and revelatory. "You have to trust yourself more with film," Jacob observed. "Trust your eye, your instincts." "Yes," I agreed, pleased by his insight. "And accept that some images won't work out the way you envisioned. There's a certain surrender to the process." After finishing the roll, we sat in comfortable silence as night fell fully, the lake disappearing into darkness, punctuated only by the occasional lights from homes on the distant shore. Jacob's voice, when he finally spoke, was thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you did with your will, the conditions you set." I turned to look at him, his profile barely visible in the dim porch light. "And? It's not really about the money, is it? It's about values, about what kind of person you want your inheritance to help create." His perceptiveness shouldn't have surprised me. Jacob had always been an observant child, deeply attuned to the currents of emotion and meaning beneath surface conversations, but the maturity of his understanding moved me. "That's exactly right," I said. "The money itself is just a tool. What matters is how it's used and who you become in the process of receiving it." He nodded slowly. "I've been looking into the Peace Corps, their environmental conservation programs. I think that might be what I want to do after college." The declaration hung in the night air between us, significant not just for its content, but for the fact that he had shared it with me first, before his parents or friends. It was a gift of trust, an acknowledgement of our deepening connection. "That sounds like a perfect fit for you," I said simply, resisting the urge to overwhelm his confidence with excessive enthusiasm. "Dad will probably think it's a waste of time," he said, a hint of tension in his voice. 2 years when I could be starting a career, building connections." "Your father might surprise you," I suggested. "He's changing too." Jacob considered this, then nodded. "Maybe you're right. He's different since the shelter work, less driven, somehow, more present." "We're all evolving," I observed. "That's what life is, if we're doing it right." The next morning, I called Edward to share Jacob's interest in the Peace Corps, suggesting he might want to create space for his son to discuss it without feeling judged. To my delight, Edward's response was immediately supportive. "The environmental work?" he asked. He mentioned it briefly before Italy, but I didn't realize he was seriously considering it. "It seems like a genuine calling for him," I said. "Then he should absolutely pursue it," Edward said firmly. What's the point of all the advantages we've given him if he can't use them to follow his own path? The sentiment was so unexpected, so unlike the ambitious, security-focused Edward of even a year ago, that I momentarily lost my voice. "Mom, are you still there?" "Yes," I managed. "I'm just pleased by your response." "Because you thought I'd disapprove," he said, not as an accusation, but as a simple acknowledgement of how I might have perceived him. "I wasn't sure," I admitted. "Career has always been so important to you." "It still is," he said. "But I'm learning there are different ways to measure success." He paused. "The men I work with at the shelter, some of them had high-powered careers, large salaries. Now they're grateful for a warm meal and a safe place to sleep. It puts things in perspective." "It does," I agreed. "Besides," he continued with a warmth that reminded me powerfully of Harrison, "Jacob has always had a good compass. Even when Vanessa and I were too busy to notice, he was finding his own true north. I trust him to make the right choices for himself." After we hung up, I sat for a long time at my kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling before me as I contemplated the profound shifts occurring within my family. The changes to my will, born initially from hurt and a desire to be seen, had catalyzed something far more significant than I could have anticipated. They had created space for authentic conversations about purpose, legacy, and the responsibility that accompanies privilege. They had invited my children to reconsider not just their relationship with me, but their own values and choices. And somewhere in that process, we had all begun to see each other more clearly, not as fixed characters in a family drama, but as evolving individuals connected by bonds that could stretch and strengthen rather than confine. The weeks that followed brought a steady rhythm of small, meaningful connections. Regina called every few days with updates on the shelter project, her voice animated as she described the community partnerships forming around it. Edward began joining me for Sunday breakfasts at the cottage, sometimes bringing Vanessa and the younger children, sometimes coming alone for quiet conversations on the porch. Jacob and I developed a photography routine, venturing out with the Nikon each weekend to capture different aspects of Millfield and its surroundings. Elliot at the photography shop became an enthusiastic supporter of our project, setting aside a corner of his back room where we could develop our own film in a makeshift darkroom. The magic of watching images emerge in the developer tray captivated Jacob just as it had captivated me decades ago. That alchemical moment when blank paper gradually reveals the hidden image, like a memory surfacing from the depths of consciousness. "It's completely different from digital," Jacob observed as we hung our first successful prints to dry. "More, I don't know, tactile? Real?" "There's an element of faith involved," I agreed. "You create the image without seeing it. Trust the chemical process to reveal what you've captured." He nodded, studying a photograph he'd taken of an elderly couple sitting on a park bench, their weathered hands intertwined between them. "I like that you can't immediately delete and try again. It makes you more deliberate about what you choose to photograph." This growing passion for photography led Jacob to propose a more ambitious project, documenting the volunteer work at Edward's homeless shelter, creating a photo essay that would humanize the residents and challenge stereotypes about homelessness. Edward enthusiastically supported the idea, and soon the three of us were collaborating on something that combined our diverse skills and perspectives. The project deepened with Regina's involvement. She arranged for some of her architecture students to join us, sketching the existing shelter space and brainstorming improvements that could be incorporated into the new facility being planned. What began as a simple photography project evolved into a multi-generational, interdisciplinary exploration of community, dignity, and the physical and social structures that either support or undermine human flourishing. One evening, as we were reviewing prints spread across my dining table, Regina looked up with an expression of sudden inspiration. "These need to be seen," she said, "not just by us, but by the community. Edward nodded slowly. An exhibition, you mean? Yes, but more than that. Regina's hands moved animatedly as she spoke, sketching invisible structures in the air. What if we created an immersive experience? The photographs, the architectural renderings, personal stories from shelter residents, resource information. For people wanting to help, all presented together in a space designed to encourage reflection and action. The library has an exhibition hall, I suggested, my own excitement building. We could approach them about hosting it. Jacob's eyes lit up. And we could include a portrait studio during the opening, invite community members to sit for photographs with shelter residents, breaking down the US versus them mentality. The idea took root and blossomed rapidly. Millfield Public Library, where I had worked for 30 years and which would one day bear Harrison's name thanks to my bequest, eagerly agreed to host the exhibition. Local businesses offered sponsorship, covering costs for professional printing and exhibition materials. Regina's architecture firm donated design services for the installation. Edward's connections in the financial world secured funding for transportation, so shelter residents could attend the opening and participate fully in the event. As we worked together to bring this vision to life, I watched my children with quiet amazement. They had always been capable, accomplished individuals, but seeing them collaborate, combining Edward's organizational skills and network with Regina's, design thinking and attention to detail, revealed dimensions of their personalities that had previously been obscured by their separate paths. They complement each other beautifully, Vanessa observed one afternoon as we watched them debate the layout for the exhibition. They always did, even as children, but somewhere along the way they forgot how to work together. Competition replaced cooperation, I agreed. Success became a zero-sum game. She nodded, her expression thoughtful. Edward talks about that sometimes now, how he got caught up in measuring himself against others, always needing to be better, have more. And now? Now he's finding different metrics, she said simply, different sources of satisfaction. The evening of the exhibition opening arrived on a perfect early autumn day, the kind where summer's warmth lingers, but the first hints of fall color touch the trees. I stood in the library's entrance hall, watching as community members, shelter residents, local officials, and curious onlookers mingled together, drawn by the powerful black and white images that lined the walls. Jacob had exceeded all expectations with his photography. His portraits captured the dignity, resilience, and individuality of people often reduced to statistics or stereotypes. One image in particular drew consistent attention. An older man named Marcus sitting in the shelter's common room, his hands, a carpenter's hands, strong and scarred from decades of work, cradling a book of poetry, his expression one of complete absorption in the words before him. Beside each portrait hung architectural renderings from Regina's students, showing designs for living spaces that honored the needs and humanity of their potential inhabitants. Not sterile institutional settings, but thoughtfully conceived environments that could foster healing, community, and transition back to stability. And interspersed throughout were quotations from shelter residents, sharing their stories in their own words, printed in elegant typography that gave their experiences the gravitas of literature. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a large format photograph I had taken, Edward sitting at a table in the shelter kitchen, deep in conversation with Carlos, the former chef now leading cooking classes. Neither man was looking at the camera. They were entirely present with each other, engaged in dialogue that transcended their different circumstances. The image captured something essential about human connection, its power to bridge divides of experience and privilege. As the evening progressed, I found myself standing before this photograph, studying the face of my son, the intensity of his attention, the absence of the distracted, calculating expression that had become habitual during his years of climbing, the corporate ladder. This was Edward as he was meant to be, fully present, genuinely engaged, using his intelligence and resources to address real needs rather than abstract financial metrics. "It's a remarkable photograph," said a voice beside me, and I turned to find Sofia Beneventi, our distant cousin from Porto-Venere, smiling warmly at me. "Sophia!" I exclaimed in delighted surprise. "What are you doing here?" She embraced me with typical Italian effusiveness. "Your children invited me. They arranged everything, the flight, the hotel. They said it was important for me to see this part of the family's story too, not just the Italian chapters." I was momentarily speechless, moved beyond words by this thoughtful gesture from Edward and Regina. They had recognized the significance of reconnecting with our Italian heritage and had found a way to extend that connection beyond our trip. "You've created something beautiful here," Sophia continued, gesturing around the exhibition space. "Not just the photographs and designs, but this sense of, how do you say it, community, belonging." "We're trying," I said. "It's a beginning." "The best legacies always are," she observed with the wisdom of someone whose family had occupied the same village for countless generations. "They continue beyond us." As if summoned by our conversation, Edward and Regina appeared beside us, both glowing with the success of the evening. They greeted Sophia warmly, then Edward turned to me with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mom, we have news," he said. "The city council just voted unanimously to approve the land donation for the new shelter project. And my firm has committed to providing all architectural services pro bono," Regina added. "We're really doing this." "The Pendlewick Community Center," Edward specified, "named after Dad." I felt tears spring to my eyes at this unexpected tribute. "Harrison would be honored," I managed. "So honored." "It was Jacob's idea," Regina said, glancing across the room to where her nephew was photographing visitors' reactions to the exhibition. "He said Grandpa always told him that true wealth isn't what you have, but what you do with it." "That sounds exactly like your father," I agreed, my heart full. As the evening wound down, I found myself drawn to a quiet corner of the exhibition where a small group of photographs hung somewhat apart from the main display. Unlike the shelter portraits, these were images from our Italy trip. Not typical tourist snapshots, but intimate moments captured with an artist's eye. Edward and Regina laughing together at a cafe table in Rome, Vanessa teaching Daniel basics, Italian phrases as they walked through a Florentine market, Jacob helping his younger cousins feed pigeons in Venice's St. Mark's Square, and me, standing on a cliff in Porto-Venere, looking out over the Mediterranean with an expression of peaceful contentment. A placard beside these images read, "Family is not just where we come from, but where we choose to go together." These photographs honor Dorothea Pendlewick, whose courage in changing her inheritance plan challenged us all to reconsider what truly matters, not what we leave behind, but how we live each day. I stood before this unexpected tribute, overwhelmed by emotion. When Edward joined me, slipping his arm around my shoulders, I could only shake my head wordlessly. "Too much?" he asked gently. "No," I managed finally. "Just unexpected." "We wanted people to understand the full context," he explained. "How this exhibition, this project, all of it really began with you standing up for yourself, demanding to be seen." "I never intended." "We know," he said simply. "You were protecting yourself, not trying to change us. But sometimes the most powerful changes come from unintended consequences." I leaned against my son, accepting his support, his understanding. "When I changed my will, I was angry," I admitted. "Hurt. I wanted to shake you both out of your complacency." "And you did," he acknowledged without defensiveness. "Thank God you did." As the last visitors departed and we began the process of shutting down for the night, I found myself standing alone in the center of the exhibition space, surrounded by images that told a story far more complex and hopeful than I could have imagined when I first sat in Marcus Whitman's office, determined to change my inheritance plan. That decision, born from the pain of exclusion, from feeling erased from my own family's picture, had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately brought us all back into clearer focus. Not perfectly aligned, not without ongoing challenges and differences, but genuinely present to each other in ways we hadn't been for years. Regina approached, carrying my coat. "Ready to go, Mom?" I nodded, taking one last look around the room. "It's been a remarkable evening." "The first of many," she said with quiet confidence. "This is just the beginning." As we walked out into the cool autumn night, stars visible above despite the town's lights, I felt a profound sense of rightness settle over me. The journey that had begun with that excluded family photo had brought me full circle, not back to where I started, but forward to a new understanding of what it means to be seen, to belong, to matter. I had changed my inheritance plan, believing it might be my final significant act, a posthumous attempt to instill values that seemed in danger of being lost. Instead, it had become a catalyst for renewal, while I was still very much alive, still capable of participating in and witnessing the transformation it inspired. Standing on the library steps with my children beside me, looking out at the town that had been our home for so many years, I silently thanked Harrison for the love that had made this family possible, for the values he had helped instill, for the legacy that continued to unfold in ways neither of us could have foreseen. And I thanked myself, the younger woman who had found the strength to raise 2 children alone after devastating loss, the middle-aged librarian who had quietly supported her community for decades, and most recently, the elderly mother who had refused to accept invisibility, who had reclaimed her place not just in family photographs, but in the ongoing story of her own life. As Edward helped me into his car for the drive back to my cottage, he asked, "What are you thinking, Mom? You're smiling." "I'm thinking," I replied, "that changing my inheritance plan was the best decision I ever made, not because of what will happen after I'm gone, but because of how it's changing all of us while we're still here together." He nodded, understanding. "Perfectly." "The best inheritances," he said, echoing Jacob's earlier insight, "aren't about money at all." "No," I agreed, as we drove through the quiet streets toward home. "They're about the stories we tell, the values we embody, the love we share in this brief, precious time we have together." And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that no matter what family photographs might be taken in the years to come, I would always be present in them, not as an afterthought or an obligation, but as an essential part of the ongoing narrative that connected us all across time, across oceans, across the inevitable changes that life brings to every family. I was Dorothea Pendlewick, mother, grandmother, photographer, catalyst for change. And I was, finally and completely visible, to my children, to my community, and most importantly, to myself. Months passed, and with each changing season, I watched my newfound visibility bloom in ways I never could have predicted. Winter settled over the lake, transforming my cottage into a snow globe scene of pristine beauty. I'd stand at my window watching cardinals flash like drops of blood against the white landscape. Harrison curled at my feet, and contemplate the extraordinary ripple effects of that one decisive moment when I'd changed my inheritance plan. Life often pivots on such moments, decisions made from pain or clarity that alter everything that follows. For me, that excluded family photo had been the stone dropped into still water, creating concentric circles of change that continued to expand outward, touching aspects of our family that I never could have anticipated. On a particularly cold January evening, as I sat before the fire with a book open in my lap, my doorbell rang. Outside stood Regina, snowflakes catching in her hair, cheeks flushed from the cold. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," she said, stamping snow from her boots in the entryway. "I was driving home from a meeting about the Pendlewick Center, and found myself turning toward your place instead. You never need an invitation, I assured her, taking her coat and ushering her toward the warmth of the fire. As we settled, with mugs of tea, Regina seemed unusually contemplative, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. The contractor broke ground today, she said finally. Even in the snow, they're determined to stay on schedule. That's wonderful news, I replied, knowing how much the shelter project meant to her. It is. She nodded, then turned to face me directly. But that's not why I came. I've been thinking about something you said in Italy, about how you stopped seeing yourself clearly after Dad died, how you set aside parts of yourself to focus on raising us. I nodded, uncertain where this was leading. I've been doing the same thing, she admitted, her voice softer than usual. Setting myself aside to build my career, to be the perfect mother, the successful professional. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what I wanted beyond those roles. This vulnerability from my always composed daughter moved me deeply. And what do you want, Regina? She looked down at her hands, elegant fingers turning her mug slowly. I'm not entirely sure yet, but I've started painting again. Painting? I echoed, surprised. I didn't know you still... I haven't, she cut in. Not since college, but watching you reclaim your photography, seeing how it connects you to something essential, I realized I've been hungry for that kind of creative outlet too. I thought back to Regina as a teenager, spending hours in her room with watercolors and sketchbooks, creating dreamlike landscapes that revealed a sensitivity so different from her practical, organized approach to everything else. That artistic side had been gradually subsumed by architectural drafting, technical precision, professional advancement. I'd love to see your work, I said simply. It's terrible, she laughed, a rare self-deprecating moment. I'm so rusty, but it feels necessary somehow, like breathing. I reached over to squeeze her hand. That's exactly what matters. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling, Harrison occasionally sighing in his sleep. Finally, Regina spoke again, her voice thoughtful. When you changed your will, I was furious, convinced you were trying to control us from beyond the grave. She met my eyes directly. But now, I understand you were doing the opposite. You were creating space for us to reconnect with values we'd lost sight of, to remember who we wanted to be. I was trying to protect myself, I admitted, to assert that I still mattered. I never imagined how it would transform all of us. The best decisions often work that way, she observed. Their true impact isn't what we initially intend. Later that night, after Regina had gone, I sat looking through old photograph albums, images of my children growing up, of Harrison and me in our younger days, of places we'd lived and loved. Among them, I found a photograph I hadn't seen in years. Regina, at 16, sitting before an easel in the backyard of our old house, completely absorbed in the watercolor landscape taking shape beneath her brush. Her face in that moment, serene, focused, connected to some inner vision, looked remarkably like the expression I'd glimpsed tonight as she spoke about painting again. We are never just one thing, one role, one version of ourselves. Life continually invites us to shed old skins, to rediscover forgotten parts, to evolve into more complex and authentic beings. My children were experiencing this journey now, stimulated, in part by my own refusal to remain in the comfortable but confining box they had unconsciously placed me in. Edward's transformation continued to unfold alongside his sisters. The executive who had once measured success in promotions and profit margins now evaluated his life by different standards. The relationships he was building, the tangible differences he was making in his community, the quality of his presence with those he loved. One Sunday morning after our regular breakfast together, he lingered at my kitchen table, turning his coffee mug between his hands in a gesture reminiscent of his sister's. "I've been offered a promotion," he said finally. Senior VP, significant. Salary increase, more responsibility. Congratulations, I replied, watching his face carefully. That's what you've been working toward, isn't it? He nodded, but his expression remained troubled. It would mean less time for the shelter project, less flexibility for family, more travel. And how do you feel about that? I kept my tone neutral, allowing him space to find his own answer. He was quiet for a long moment, then said with evident surprise, I'm going to turn it down. Are you sure? Yes. The certainty in his voice was striking. A year ago, I would have taken it without hesitation. But now, he looked around my small, cozy kitchen, then out the window toward the lake where ice was beginning to thaw along the edges. Now I understand there are different kinds of wealth, different measures of success. Your father would be so proud of you, I said softly. Edward's eyes met mine, and I saw in them a clarity that reminded me powerfully of Harrison. He saw this all along, didn't he? What really matters? He did, I agreed. And somewhere inside, so did you. As winter released its grip and the first tentative signs of spring appeared around the lake, I found myself contemplating the nature of legacy with new insight. We often think of it in terms of what we leave behind, money, property, accomplishments, but its true essence is more fluid, more alive. Legacy is the ongoing conversation between generations, the values that travel forward through time, taking new forms, but carrying the same essential truths. Harrison's legacy lived on, not just in the shelter that would bear his name, but in our children's evolving understanding of success and purpose. My legacy would include not only the financial provisions of my revised will, but the unexpected awakening it had catalyzed within our family. And perhaps most importantly, I had claimed the right to participate in creating that legacy while still very much alive, to shape it actively rather than leaving it to be interpreted after I was gone. The woman who had once been asked to step out of the family photograph was now firmly at the center of an unfolding story that belonged to all of us. One morning in early April, as delicate green buds appeared on the trees surrounding my cottage, I received a large envelope in the mail. Inside was a beautifully bound book titled Seeing Clearly, The Pendlewick Family Journey. Opening it, I discovered a collection of photographs, Jacob's images from the shelter project, snapshots from our Italy trip, historical photos of Harrison's ancestors, and even some of my own early newspaper photographs that Jacob had discovered in archives. Interspersed with these images were reflections written by each family member: Edward on redefining success, Regina on rediscovering creativity, Vanessa and Daniel on creating meaningful family traditions, the grandchildren on learning family history. And at the very end was a letter addressed to me, signed by everyone. To Dorothea, who taught us that being truly seen is both a right and a gift, one that we must extend to others as generously as we claim it for ourselves. Your courage in changing your inheritance plan changed far more than legal documents. It changed how we see ourselves, each other, and the responsibilities that come with privilege. This is the true inheritance you've given us, one we receive gratefully while you are here to witness its impact. I closed the book, tears blurring my vision, overcome with the profound understanding that I had received exactly what I had most desired. Not just inclusion in family photographs, but true recognition of my complete self, my history, my values, my ongoing journey. The greatest inheritance we can leave is not financial wealth, but the example of a life fully lived, with purpose and presence. And the greatest gift we can receive is to be truly seen, in all our complexity, by those we love most. The lake outside. My window reflected the spring sunlight, ripples catching and scattering the light in ever-changing patterns. Like family, I thought, constant yet always evolving, reflecting our truest selves back to us, if only we have the courage to look deeply. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.